Don Debar. We had a program that aired yesterday, and now this is going to be following on that. Don, welcome back. It's so good talking to you as always.
Long time no see.
We ended. We're too long. We got to be in touch.
I know.
We got to stay in touch and everything. But we ended up talking about Libya at the end of the program after a wide-ranging interview, discussion of things. And it was interesting you brought it up. You had that. It might be worthwhile. You had an understanding of. Libya, you've been there a little bit. Why don't we talk a little bit about your own exposure to the country? Right. You had ticked off some of the characteristics of that country.
You know, there's some things that were interesting about it. I was fascinated by Libya for the same reason that I, was fascinated by the Soviet Union and some of the other objects of American scorn over time and negative propaganda. There was a group of people living outside of the control of the imperial paradigm.
Right.
And regardless of what's going on where they are, they're outside of this model that dominates most of the rest of the planet. And also the fact that that they are organized differently. Aside from being, separate, that they had different theories of how people relate and how wealth should be distributed and work, distributed and such.
We said in the program yesterday you were born about 1968, 69.
No, I was born in 1954.
Oh, 54. Sorry, you came to the age of 50.
Yeah.
And it was there that they made their revolution in 1969.
That's correct.
September 1 of 1969, they overthrew the King of Dras.
That's right.
And that Libya had been among the very low, the least developed countries in the world, down the poorest countries in the world. They had suffered a terrible Holocaust. I don't know if you were familiar with that or people have. We usually think of the Holocaust as strictly relating to Jewish people, but the Holocaust had been delivered down on a lot of people, including American Indians and others, including Libya. And they had 1/3 to 1/2 of their population ruthlessly decimated with concentration camps and so forth that were presaging what was to happen to the Jews of Europe following under the Italian fascists. Omar Mukhtar fought against that occupation. They suffered that, and then they made this revolution. Then they found very rich oil, very close to the market and so forth, and he took over, and they set up a country in about 2 weeks after the Woodstock Festival was kicked off by my friend Richie Havens singing Freedom up in Woodstock, right? So, I mean, it was of that era, right?
That's true. That's
and then they went from where they, if I may, they went from where they had the lowest standards, like literacy, all of the human index numbers and so forth, were at the bottom of the list, as it were, when he took over. And in a mere 20 or 30 years or so, they went to where they're certainly the top for all of Africa.
For sure.
And for the top of, they went from 0 literacy or 10% literacy to 93% literacy. Sanitation, housing, as you said in the program that ended yesterday, all of this. And they all went to the top, including education and women's liberation by the standards of the area and so forth, people owning their own home, their own automobile, education, health, all of that available to them, infrastructure into every village, electricity into every village. They did the Man River Project, where they brought fossil water to the north.
To the desert.
They got a great deal of money. They were like Norway. They were a small population with rich oil deposits, and he spread it around. So it's got to be just at a material level. There are going to be a lot of people, unlike our propaganda we're besieged with now about that country, who are going to be in support of him and what he was able to achieve, if only at a materialistic level.
One of the things that, yes, that's right.
Not to mention ideological, which we can get to. And I think the support is widespread, and the idea that it's going to topple, that we would like to think, is ill-advising our foreign policy leadership.
I think it's a delusion. One of the things that I found most dissonant at the very beginning of this particular, you want to call it crisis or situation with Libya, was the idea, you have unrest everywhere, okay, as potentiality. If you and I are the only 2 people in the world and there is enough for us to, get along fine, and then there's either a shortage of one small thing and we have to apportion it And so you and I each only get 80% of the 100% we wanted or expected. There's going to be disappointment. And depending on a variety of pathological potentialities, there's going to be some kind of a response. You have in an economy, say some limits to certain resources, and they're going to be apportioned and allocated across the economy. If I'm not getting everything I want because it's going to another sector or something, and if that's going to feel like an insult in one way or another, and there's going to be some latent problem, that I'm going to have with the way things are done, because I didn't get everything I wanted. I mean, that's normal. That's a normal response.
I guess so,
Well, how it gets channeled is another matter. But that's normal, and I would say statistically certainly, and I think it's probably wired or part of how we're wired.
Interesting.
Okay. Okay. Now, if you look across a political system, certainly you have from one system to another conditions where here people do more or less, closer to an egalitarian way than they do here, where, say, you have, two guys own everything and everybody else owns nothing. Here, there's a variety of maybe 10% from the wealthiest to the poorest, and so you would expect to see more discontent here and less discontent here.
Sure.
It doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah, right.
And because these things aren't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
If there's rigid social, political control here and not here, you might actually see more expression of dissent here than you do here.
Right, you are.
And if there are other factors, other sociological factors, say you have, more or less identical whatever measures, class, ethnicity, whatever, here, and you have more diversity here, you might have, again, a variety in the way things are expressed. It'll have to do with how people are acculturated. You might, and I would hope to expect, where you have a more diverse culture, people are acculturated to tolerate differences on broader bands and to look at it as a wealth and a resource. However, sometimes people are acculturated in exactly the opposite way,
white bread,
intentionally, so that there is discord and things. But in any event, there's a variety of ways that people's satisfaction with the existing order can be experienced and be expressed.
Right. Okay. All
now,
well said.
okay, so you have all that.
Yeah.
Now, in the particular history of Libya, there was tribal organization. There were, from the time of the colonial powers, certainly manipulation of tribal antagonisms, and they were promoted where other aspects of tribal organization that were more synergistic were sort of suppressed. This is what happened in the colonial world. Of course, they arbitrarily drew national boundaries, so that where you might have had a more or less homogenous group of people here before, now, and then another one next to it, you split them down the middle, you have two groups where you had one, and you don't have a whole group in either place. And
they were all drawn by European powers in the 19th century
intentionally,
in Africa.
Intentionally, and in this area, that's one of them. So up until the king was deposed in 1969, Idris, then you had severe problems, particularly, say, between eastern and western Libya, where there were divisions. And
it had always been there. Yeah,
right.
They had a large confederation, Senussi, and then there's Gaddafi in the west, and Senussi, and they never did get along well and everything. And then another in the south, and there's others, and so there's tribal identities are really important.
So then, after Idris is out, Gaddafi basically reintegrates in different ways the tribal organizations.
Tries to. He always had opposition from Benghazi.
There was always opposition among elements of, where you have elements that are distinct one from the other. Some of the folks who are in control of those things are there exactly because of that reason. And so as you attempt to solve that problem, what you're doing is solving the raison for them to be there in the first place, and they will resist it and massage those antagonisms. And just a quick sidetrack example of it, one of the divisions that was used formerly and has been used in other North African countries is divisions over race or color. And what we've seen happen in Libya right now is that in the Benghazi area, in the rebel-controlled areas, One of the first items that was introduced there was the idea of race, and basically they completely disregarded, because they don't actually accept that black Africans are Libyans, that are black Libyans. There's a racist aspect to that at the head end. But painted basically, that person over there is not a black Libyan, but rather they are black mercenaries from someplace else that are here hired by the tyrant to suppress you. They massaged that from the very beginning, and you started to see right away lynchings and brutal murders of black Libyans in the eastern part of the country.
Racist.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It is African continent.
This was a propaganda weapon employed by the U.S. allies, surprise, at the very outset of the struggle that's taking place in Libya right now.
And CIA has been involved in the East.
Well, they promote these things.
They've been doing it, the CIA and the DIA. The Defense Intelligence Agency. They are involved in that. Okay,
All right, so that was just a sidetrack, because I want to come back to that. But what happens is you have these historical antagonisms that had been being resolved, that were in many ways largely resolved in the daily operation of the country, and yet you have had legacy of this. You have some animosity towards the central or the balance of Libya from the east. That's been there for a while.
From the west.
No,
it was from
towards the west, from Benghazi. I'm talking about. Oh well, the people there had hostility towards the
Tripoli.
Towards Tripoli.
Yeah, that was there. That was that. But the benefits went to the whole of the country.
I'm saying
Idris,
yes.
Idris
I'm
was
talking about
in
this as a
accord,
legacy.
Yeah, Idris was in accord with the Western powers, and the largest base we had, a big SAC base at Wheelers, was a huge thing. And I think there's a great deal of interest in controlling Africa. And that there are AFRICOMs in Europe. It has to be in Europe because there's no country in Africa that's going to accept Western colonialism, as has been the case and everything like that. But there was that. But they're flying the flag of Idris. They're flying the flag of a monarchy that was in kissing the hem of imperialist Western powers, European powers.
Hey, go back, 2 months before the bombing started, if that, to the image of French troops taking the president of Cote d'Ivoire out of his palace at gunpoint.
Not to mention the Battle of Algiers in Algeria, just down the pike, to the west.
But I'm talking just within this particular historical moment. This is what we have. We have AFRICOM coming online finally in like October of 2008, after several years attempts to construct this, and then we have this crisis that took place in Cote d'Ivoire that resulted, as I said, well, it's not over yet.
There were a lot of
killed.
It's not
the end of history, but and all of this essentially a foothold for France, at least as the face of imperialism back in its former colony.
Absolutely.
Taking the elected president of the country out at gunpoint.
Yeah, right. Okay? Well, look what they did with Aristide. The United States did. In Haiti. But anyway,
So then you have...
There's an arrogance of power on the part of the Europeans who are used to being... because those are only wogs. The British used to call them wogs, the backward... Do you understand?
Yes.
And I think there's a great deal of resentment against that. And also, Libya was the first country, even under Idris, out of the Second World War period, 1951, to be recognized by the UN. It was the beginning of a recognition of the liberation, and Gaddafi supported all the liberation studies, and Mandela counted him the best supporter of anti-apartheid.
That's right.
Yeah, so he's got some pretty interesting allies if you're concerned about people who are concerned with what they call the least among us.
Right. Yeah. Well, on that point, there are people right now in South Africa, as a matter of fact, that are organizing to try to compel, or to encourage, but to make happen former President Mandela to actually speak out. Because Zuma has been, he's been essentially a comprador. He's got his own issues.
He's got problems.
Way back.
They all do.
But South Africa voted to enable the bombing of an African city that is the capital of a place that Mandela credited with helping to get rid of apartheid.
No, more than helping. He said nobody else outside of South Africa. Nobody except Muammar Gaddafi did more to help the breaking the back of apartheid.
And this is now Zuma saying to the United States, go ahead and bomb.
Well, it's hard to know how they vote certain kind of things. I don't quite understand some of the voting that goes on within our congressional systems.
No, he voted. This is a clear up and down vote on UN Security Council resolutions 1970 and 1973.
What's
South
1970?
Africa. 1970 was sanctions, and they were
when
companions.
was that voted in?
They were companion bills.
Within
days.
tandem.
Yeah,
okay,
right, yep.
I didn't realize in 1970.
First it was sanctions, and then it was a no-fly zone and authority to do other stuff.
I have a big connection.
Is being interpreted as being allowed to do this.
As you know from the previous program, I have a great affection and association with the numbers 1970.
Well,
I think 1970 is likely to emerge as year one.
Yeah, you said before, yeah.
That there were things going on.
Well, we spoke yesterday about basically the grand unified theory of everything we were discussing, kind of, in a way.
The case can be made for. Why
I know, I agree.
You know what 5,772 means in terms of the Jewish calendar?
No.
That's when the whole universe was created, 1970, 5,000 years ago.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's kind of laughable.
That's interesting.
You know, okay, anyway, but Libya,
All right,
okay.
so anyway, let's go back. So there are people right now on the ground in South Africa that I've been communicating with that are trying to, with an effort to encourage Mandela to speak out. Because Zuma just yesterday or the day before yesterday declared
that
the president of South Africa, who's had all kinds of problems in his past as a politician, allegations of crooked money stuff, all kinds of things. Yeah. Zuma said that the International Criminal Court warrant, if you can call it that, will be respected in South Africa. That if Gaddafi were to come to South Africa, he would be arrested and turned over to the ICC.
He did say that?
Yes.
What a crazy... Well, okay, that's interesting.
So he's drawing the lines.
Yeah,
So what we're asking former President Mandela to do, what people there are doing, is to say, look, it's time to chime in.
Yeah.
This guy was instrumental, if anyone outside the country was, in doing away with apartheid. Yeah. Now this is being done to the people of Libya, and he's a figure of what they're doing.
Yeah, but remember, Mandela was called a terrorist by the British. You know,
That's how it works.
And George Washington was called a terrorist by George III. They always are. It's a term. And it seems to me, what's this International Criminal Court? It's a European thing. And
the United States doesn't recognize its jurisdiction.
Why doesn't the African Union, which Libya has been, Muammar Gaddafi's tried to get, he's head of the African Union, also moving toward the United States of Africa.
That's right.
Why don't the African nations set up a criminal court so that they could bring into their jurisdiction the war criminals on the imperialist side? We could maybe put Mr. Bush in the dock and that sort of thing. What in the hell is that International Criminal Court? It's only...
How about a judgment for reparations for Africa?
Thank you. Well,
that would then be enforced but we'll go to your question. First of all, the African Union encompasses every nation on the continent except for Mozambique.
Okay, I didn't realize Mozambique.
Every nation on the continent. And so...
54, I think. Yeah, 54 nation-states,
right.
yeah.
So...
a lot of ethnic identities within that. Yeah,
in terms of nationalities.
And tribes,
So that's all of Africa, basically.
And it's a very rich continent in terms of resources. Sudan could feed the whole world.
This is why they are fighting over it, because there's the elite that has control of the bulk of the rest of the planet sees this as either, oh, well, we don't own that yet, so let's get it, or, well, when we use this up, that's there. We need to secure control of it now.
They don't want it except for the thing. Rwanda, they didn't bother, because it was just the Wogs killing the Wogs, or something like
Whatever
that.
Their
and
motivation.
They do not have any interest in the least among us. The political leadership of imperialism is only interested in the elites of the world that they can do business with, and they're not interested, and there's no one interested in the least advantaged, 80% of the world population that is not being advantaged by the system and so forth. They don't care about that or more than the advertising.
Look at, go to your congressional representative or anybody in the state legislature or whatever. In the main, if there's a guy down, living on the corner that, is needs $20 to live or something, they'll never hear of it, let alone do anything about it.
That's a metaphor.
But if there's somebody that contributes money to their campaign,
you'll hear,
right? Before they drop a pin before it hits the ground, their hand is there to catch it.
That's it. And something I'll back up a little bit. In a certain sense, I just got through reading. I did it a couple of weeks ago. Vonnegut again, and at the end of the Second World War, when the United States had absolute, in '45, absolute total air superiority, they had no question about it. There was nothing could be done against doing whatever we wanted there in terms of bombs. We went and firebombed Dresden.
Right.
Beautiful city, killing hundreds of thousands of men, no, of women and children by and large, civilians, completely. Right. They knew they were going to kill civilians. It was a war crime that Mr. Eisenhower committed.
Right.
But you'll notice, if you're the winner...
That's right.
No, listen, if you're the winner, you're above the law.
No.
If you're the winner, you're above the law. The law does not apply to you. It only applies to the loser.
If you're the winner, you are the law.
Yeah. No, but do you understand what I'm saying? So these courts, that are kind of called war crimes, they should start putting in the dock somehow the people that were responsible for how many deaths have we been responsible for in Iraq? Close to 2.5 million people or something. 500,000 were going to die, children, in Iraq by the sanctions. The leaders, the people are the real criminals, are those that are at the heads of and above the law.
Absolutely.
Do you understand?
So listen,
and that's something
let's talk about
shouldn't be accepted.
I agree with that. Let's go to the ICC. Let's go to the ICC because that's where
that's the
starting.
ICC.
The ICC, first of all, is not recognized by the United States as having jurisdiction over its citizens or over its officials. The U.S. is not a signatory to it. So if the ICC tried to serve me with a parking ticket for parking in front of their building or something, I can laugh in their face.
Unless that's the International Criminal Court.
Unless I end up...
Is it in La Hague?
Yes, So unless I end up someplace where the government does acknowledge their jurisdiction.
Like don't go in their embassy.
Or like Zuma. If I ended up in South Africa right now, and Zuma said, oh, by the way, we're also going to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the ICC over parking tickets, then I better stay out of Johannesburg.
And all of the people that are there, most of the people that they have any grief against are all Africans, I noticed, by and large, except the Bosnia thing.
Well, there's, in the main, the people that have power and that gravitate towards, where the centers gravitate towards Europe and North America, that's who they're in service to, and the further you travel from those circles, the more you end up being the one being serviced upon. But so go back to, okay, you have the ICC that's the tool that's being used here right now. You talk about maybe setting up an analogous court in Africa. As I started to say, you have every nation save Mozambique as a member of the AU. If there were a court set up there, and if there were a process that determined that the nations of Africa, the peoples of Africa, have been damaged to the amount of X dollars because of the transcontinental slave trade, the continued oppression since then, the extraction of resources and all those other things.
Reparations.
And then they set a judgment that said that's worth, $26 trillion, whatever the number is, and they docket the judgment, and then they say we're going to execute on the judgment. First thing that they could do is to seize whatever resources are within their jurisdiction. Secondly, if you go there and you're one of the parties to this, they can seize your property, or if there's criminal charges, they can hold you and try you and such. I mean, this is simply a manifestation of who has power and who doesn't, that it's not happening. Because Africa doesn't have an air force to send across to Britain to grab, the Queen of England or, whichever knucklehead is at 10 Downing today or whatever, and drag them off.
And
or
it's
to
all,
Washington.
might makes right. Might makes right. Realpolitik, who's got the Gatling gun rules. And that's the way the history of the world has been unfolding. But there are oppositions coming to that now, and the thing with Libya, back to Libya.
So all right. So what happens with the current situation in Libya? We start to see, a real activist movement towards the African continent that is certainly represented by, if not controlled by, AFRICOM, and we see the activity in Cote d'Ivoire. We see in other places too, Somalia and other places where these guys are starting to get busy again. And then we see first Tunisia and then Egypt. You know, in Egypt, I think they'd unsettled some of the players here considerably, particularly considering Egypt is on the western border of Israel. And now, if you're looking in geopolitical terms from you know, Washington's point of view, the perfect counter move to Egypt is eastern Libya, because now you flank, rather than Egypt being, Israel being flanked by Egypt, Lebanon, and such, you now have Egypt flanked by Israel and eastern Libya, which is trying to become a client state of NATO.
Right, right. And they would like to have, I think they would just love to be able to go and reset their AFRICOM base at where it was at Wheelis.
That's right.
And just take over the continent. They would like to do it, you know, and insert themselves that way. But there's opposition coming. There's opposition from some of your normal quarters and so forth. But in general, the opposition to the attack upon Muammar Gaddafi is coming from the people, it's an overworked term, but from, in large measure, the people who are the least advantaged in the world in many cases. The Indian nations of the hemisphere, both North and South, have been royally maltreated by European colonialism, apartheid. I mean, not apartheid, Holocaust.
Genocide, right.
Genocide, right. Black people in Africa, the mass of the people who are in support. He started the African Union. They got the African Investment Bank that established a CERT in Cameroon.
Communications infrastructure.
They got communication systems.
They put up a satellite.
He's put up a lot of the sovereign funds to help the people of Africa that the West thinks of. The people of Africa don't count.
And speaking of finance, you talk about the sovereign funds of those countries. One of the interesting things that there's an example of it in Cote d'Ivoire is the control of the money supply.
Okay. Yeah.
And who prints the currency? Whose currency is it? What are the terms of which currency? Well, Cote d'Ivoire had they were pulling out. Gbagbo was like, no, we're going to print the currency here, not in Paris.
Yeah.
I had no idea that was still going on.
Right.
But it is.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, let's see. We're printing, you know, 1 billion francs, and 48 of them go to Cote d'Ivoire. You know, you all can fight over that. And Gaddafi, one of the things that he had been promoting was the development of an African, you know, a sovereign bank.
Yes, that's right.
You know, central bank, so that a real one that's controlled by, you know, by Africans.
It could supplant the IMF also, the thing that's in Cameroon that he's supporting, and he's also floated the idea of denominating oil in dinars, gold dinars.
Right. I had said,
which would give a huge advantage to them. They have a lot of gold,
they do.
and they could have a much stronger bargaining thing against the price of their very valuable oil.
And see, here's the thing:
Can't have that.
when someone else controls the currency,
that's right.
Let's say I give you a whole bunch of dollars, okay, because you had me over a barrel while we were doing business.
Right.
Now you've got all these dollars
Corleone.
of mine. Right. Okay. But if I'm printing the money, or if I'm setting fiscal policy, I can wipe monetary policy more specifically.
Yeah.
I can wipe out the value of those dollars. If I inflate, if I do different things, suddenly, you still have 20 billion US dollars, but a loaf of bread now costs $5 billion US dollars.
Yeah.
So where before you could have bought Manhattan for that money or whatever.
Yeah, but they could also challenge the IMF with all of their ideas of structural adjustment that always come down hard on the folks in order to protect the interests of the. And it's coming out of Greece now. It's coming out of this. The IMF and what I think we'll back up to patterns if we can. The pattern that's in place. Historical pattern that's in place and calls itself historically legitimate. If you look at it, I make a premise here for a minute. You tell me what you think. Seems to me if you measure things like coming out of Rome, 1,000 years of Rome, they fell apart. You had 1,000 years of dynastic states, feudalism. Legitimacy was in the crowned heads, the assize courts, the entails, all this kind of. They had a whole system and everything. And then there came the steam engine. There came 1776. You had Adam Smith.
Those things become irrelevant.
You had the Enlightenment, Hume, and that kind of thing coming. and everything. And then they set up this system in the United States of America, a bunch of bumpkins across the ocean, uprising. I was surprised. It was really touch and go. We were really going to lose. And Cornwallis, when he was coming up to Yorktown, had, I think it was 60% of the men of the South were fighting on the side of Cornwallis against George Washington. Only about 30% signed on as revolution. Anyway, they made this thing. They made a revolution against it, set up the institutional structure of the United States of America. It developed. They came in 1812 and burned Washington.
Down, yeah, right.
The Washington, I mean, the Royalists came and fought the, you know, that and everything like that. And then they developed all these institutions coming out. So we were building. We had a great continent. And then after the Second World War, we emerged as a superpower. We'd build up. So we got systems that are put, Keynesian systems, international monetary, the whole system which was there. You had critique coming from the left on the labor theory of value out of Marx and so forth. The Bolshevik Revolution imploded in 1989 and everything. So we are the superpower, and we count and that system of thinking, the notions of architecture, the notions of institutional structure, has more or less been accepted by most all of the world. The Marxists would call the people who signed on with us as running dogs. But it's our model that we're counting and saying is historically legitimate.
Right.
Is there, China is state capitalism, it seems to me.
Right,
they're just following on to us and everything. Now, Libya is possibly at the level of major thinking setting up, like the United States of America challenged the so-called agent regime of that time. Ours is an agent regime that's out of date with what the future requires, possibly. Is that something that we consider, or are we really historically legitimate, and all we have to do is get all of the world to sign on to our institutional assumptions, follow us, have the elections with the purple thumbs and everything? But do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Is the last addendum. Is it possible that Libya was setting a model that could have been a threat at an ideological level to the mighty power of the greatest empire that ever has been, the United States of America, in the modern experience, at an ideologically challenging level? That's what I'm asking.
And a material threat.
And here's how. Okay.
Here's how. Number one, it's an alternative model in several ways, which I'll touch on after that. But
we got a clip too. We want to make sure we get to it.
It's situate at at the north point of Africa. It was involved and integrated into the creation of I won't use the term United States of Africa, although it's used there.
They're trying to
but
move
it's to unify the continent into a political system. You know, an African Union, more on the model of European Union, perhaps.
Well, they got the African
whatever.
Union now.
I don't want to lose this. So the point being that Libya has played a key role in and more importantly, it was promoting the further development of some key institutions and structures that would have allowed Africa to chart its own course. And that, in and of itself, was a major threat, not just as an example to other sectors around the world, that this is something that you could also do.
He was anti-imperialist,
but also by decoupling the development of Africa from the further development of the imperialist, political and economic Megillah. The actual structures of those things, the actual structures of those things were at risk. There are some materials, minerals, and oil, things like that, that are in Africa that this imperialist elite needs for itself, and if the control of those things was outside of their hands and rather in the hands of Africans, then the terms of the exchange would be set not by imperialism but by the parties, which means that the benefits could flow to the people of Africa in a way that might not fit with the arithmetic that's in the minds of the people on the imperialist side.
Thank you. And he took a lot of sovereign funds that were benefiting the people of Africa and setting up a context and institutional structure that's going to benefit the people of Africa. You can't have that. They're people to be exploited.
And within Africa, you have this. You have the competing model of Libya as against Nigeria in terms of how does an African nation relate to the government and and economic elite relate to the people there in terms of who shares in the benefits of oil revenue. You have the Libyan model on the one hand, where the revenue is distributed to the people and is used, the capital that comes back is used to create the wherewithal for the culture and the society to develop and grow. You have housing that's adequate and owned by everyone, hospitals, educational systems, all things that are available to every Libyan on the one hand as
including
one model,
those in
and then in Nigeria you have quite the opposite, where the benefits go to Europe, to Shell, to America, to ExxonMobil. Well, so within Africa,
which is best?
Well, let me hold my argument.
Yeah,
because you have two things. One, removing Africa from the orbit of imperialism, and then within Africa, an alternate model of development so that the future of Africa as an entity can be charted. So if what's going to happen is Africa is A, going to be able to make its own decisions about where it goes, and B, it has as a model not going along with Shell and ExxonMobil, but developing itself in the way that Libyans have seen their country be developed. That is a bigger threat than any other on this planet to imperialism.
Okay,
and that is why Gaddafi, who was the not even nominal head, but the imputed head of 6 million people on a piece of desert in the north coast of Africa, is being treated as if he were the great Stalin and Hitler and everybody else combined.
Yeah, one other thing you ought to say is you're familiar. You read Green Book. I've been there 8 or 9 times. The only country I was interested in, because they set up these things, and I don't know exactly, but they set up what would be seen at a political level a participatory democracy. They set up meeting halls everywhere. The whole damn nation would meet. Everybody over 18 years old. The place physically you could go. Town hall meetings. They set them up as a participatory democratic system, political system, and people could go to those. They have those councils. It vitiated. And the people would come there from the West, and they'd say, "Well, where are all your K Street lobbyists? Where are all your, your army of your special interest representations, the lobbyists, and all the institutional cherry-the-rest organizations?"
Let me say it the way that I explain it to people that
but they
don't have
can't
a lot of
understand
political
a system where you don't get to vote every 4 years is bought by the people.
People that don't have
money.
People that don't have poli-sci degrees and that aren't, into the minutia of political structures and such. I explain it to them this way. And especially people that are familiar with like suburban municipalities. Rather than having all of the things happen in your municipality, for example, down at the city council, all the lobbying that goes on behind the scenes, all of the people that get a little get back here, there, and everything, and a guy like Bloomberg sitting on top pulling the strings. In the towns there, you go down on Tuesday to the building, the town hall, whatever it was, the Congress, whatever you call it.
Well, every citizen has access to a meeting place.
You go down there, okay? You and me, we want to change the direction of traffic on our street.
Right, or put up a traffic light.
You and me and her and his kids, we go down on Tuesday when they have the meeting. We propose it. We take a vote. Whoever showed up that night, we vote on it. It's now changed. You come home tomorrow and say, "What the hell is this? The street's going the other way. I don't like that." You go out and you organize a bunch of people, and next Tuesday you go down there and you say, "You know what? We don't like it. We have another vote." And it gets settled with it. That's the mechanism for doing this stuff.
Well, but it's not only.
I'm trying to show it in very simple terms.
I understand that, but it's not only. We could say that the town hall meetings of New England and so on. People would say, "Well, it's okay for the local traffic light or something." But what they did when they went to those meetings, they would have. I saw people talking, "Gaddafi sucks," and they would say whatever they want. They could. They were saying that, but then they were introduced. The whole country would meet, and here's our economic situation. Here's the international order. Here's the price of oil. Here is the thing over here. Should we have the river project? And they were given the information about the large movement the large context of all the societies, and they could be understanding of that, and they were included, and everybody had a way, there was a place where they could go. It's called participatory
democracy.
We can't understand
here's
participatory
here's why I brought up what I brought up before.
System that money can buy any Congress.
If you did that here, people would think they were at a football game.
Yeah.
Okay? They would be surrounded by masses of people, and they would see something coming from a screen, and they would think it was instructions. That's the way they're acculturated here politically. If they had participated at the municipal level the way I just described, and that was part of their experience like it is.
Yeah, but at the People's Party, at the People's Congresses, they're not just limited to the local.
I understand.
They're not limited. That's part of what they consider.
I'm trying to make it.
But they're bringing it. No, the point being is it doesn't apply just to the local.
I know that.
It applies to the whole national order.
That.
When they had and they tried to have sovereignty at the level of the People's Congress.
I understand.
So you don't have the election system here.
I'm not saying anything to the contrary.
Okay.
What I'm trying to explain to you is
but don't keep it just the traffic.
No, I'm not keeping it there.
Okay.
I started there.
Okay.
Okay. We kept it there because we took it somewhere else.
Okay.
What happened?
But it was unique. And
this is people's personal experience with politics. Is that on my street, for example, if I want to change something, I don't have to go down to City Hall and bribe somebody. I go down with my friends and we vote on it. And that happens and gets replicated going up.
And it goes up.
It's direct participation.
Anyway, but perhaps more important than that, in terms of an ideological threat, they had, and you've been there, I've been there 8 or 9 times, and the thing that's more interesting to me, they did not have, and I think it's well for us to understand in the interest of being in touch with reality rather than propaganda, which we're swimming in. They have the Arab and the Islamic context of thinking. They do not have any built-in, or at least in Libya, for certainly, and I think in general, any kind of an irrational opposition to the private sector or private property.
Well, it's not used as a weapon against people.
No, but I'm saying that they don't have that. So the people on the progressive left, the people on the progressive left here have the private property. They talk privatization or any of these kind of things. The private property principle, while it's been taken over by the politically powerful to great advantage to them and so forth, has been allowed to be done so in the United States, to where all the capital assets in the private sector are owned by a tiny plutocratic class. In Libya, they did not abolish, as they did in the Soviet Union, try to abolish the institution through collectivization, have everything in the government, in the public sector, you know, in the name of some sort of a democracy. But they kept the private sector, and they have a private sector in Libya. And in the private sector, but they uniquely have, and you saw these little signs, anybody who goes there, everywhere you go, little Burma-Shea said, partners, not wage earners.
Right.
And he referred to wage earners as slaves.
Right.
He said they're like slaves. And it's true, that happens to be true.
I agree.
And that's what keeps us enslaved. And that if you have a private sector business, let's say, and it's not just the local or something, a business, you can have a private sector business. All of this distribution of that wealth that was spread around through the government was socialist. They call it socialist Jamahariya. But that private sector, the business, the asset base of that business have to be owned by the people who make it up.
Right.
Not by a small class of people who own, and the other people are just workers.
Right.
They have to own the capital asset base. That's the major problem confronting mankind now, because we don't have a way of having ownership stake by the people in the capital instruments, in the technology and institutions that are encompassed by that, other than having it all owned by a tiny plutocratic class. And you don't distribute any income that way. And they just reported on CNN, the only jobs we could create is the only way to distribute it. It's just accepted. The only way to get money to people to buy food and bread for the kids is for them to have a job like a serf on a feudal estate, and they accept it. Right. And the left accepts that. But in Libya, they don't. There, they had the people who are in the private sector entity. The way the capital is formed has to be done in a way where the people who make up that company, not just the owners of the class against the workers, but everybody has to have an ownership stake in that. That's what's needed worldwide, and it's not happening anywhere in the world.
You got to be careful with something too, because first of all, along with the idea of private property, came historically the idea of human beings as private property. And another thing that goes along with the idea of private property is in other words, the idea of wage slavery only comes into play if there's someone that owns the enterprise. You know, it's one thing if I'm going to have a large enterprise, how exactly am I going to relate to the workers there? If they own it, if I'm managing it, or if I have some share of it or something as owner because I founded it, or it's my brainchild or my handicraft or whatever, okay. But you're going to have, you know, contradictory interests that are going to come to the fore pretty early, where the enterprise, the purpose of the enterprise is to satisfy me. First of all, that's why I founded it. And now you people are in service to the enterprise. I'm going to extract what I can from you and for the business, and in turn extract from the business that which I can for myself. There's a dynamic involved there that is intrinsically exploitative and ultimately leads to the consumption of the workers for the benefit of the owner. Well, then you can have private enterprise without that, but you have to be very careful that it tends towards that, because historically...
Tends toward what?
Tends towards this model at the end in late capitalist development, where you have this class up here consuming the apparatus that has consumed the workers.
Well, they've exerted that surplus value and everything like that. That's the way the whole thing's evolved, and now it's getting to be where the assets are. There was a time. My granddaddy was a union organizer in Detroit. People came off the farms. The biggest job occupation in the United States turn of the 19th century was independent farmer. Farmer and domestics was second.
That's right.
So people are coming off the farm to get a combine. Combine can plow the whole damn field and create thousands of tons of grain. They had to come to Detroit to get on the assembly, and they needed those workers.
Right.
They needed the workers in order to get the production. It was developing, and then the trend was now they are now able to produce. When you get an algorithm that can, if it's really allowed to function, to displace 500,000 people who were doing punch card things and everything like that, then you cannot continue to have the acceptance of the idea that the only way the person, the normal person who's not endowed with an estate or something, or income or something, or accumulated capital or something, the only way to get buying power into the hands of people is for them to be a worker.
Right.
And the workers are the good people.
Right.
The workers are good and they can pull the wool over the eyes. The work ethic and all of this and all your identities are wrapped up in, and the people that are objecting to the system accept that.
They
don't question the idea that, okay,
if you accept
the combine's creating all this wealth, we all should own the left nut on the third wheel or something, and by the fact that we own the left nut on the third wheel of the productive system that's creating a great deal of product, okay, we get income coming to us by the fact that we have a private property ownership stake in the overall economy.
The historical analogy to what the problem that you're talking about.
They're being blinkered.
The split that took place but in any event, the two trends that were followed in the development of working class politics in the United States, to call it that, are among the trade unionists who concede the legitimacy of the existing system and simply want to better the split between labor and capital.
Yeah, let us get more money for our labor.
You can own it, but pay me better.
Yeah.
As opposed to those who did not accept the legitimacy of the system and said that your ownership of the means of production is not acceptable.
Wait a minute, who said that within the labor union?
Nobody said that. Not within. I'm saying between the trade unionists and socialist communists.
Okay, socialist communists.
So the divergent paths.
And they came to a point.
And within socialist communists, quote unquote, if you look at what remains today in the main, at least among the old official parties, they are probably as conservative as the Teamster of 1965 was politically, in terms of for example, they think all that needs to be done is elect a Democratic Congress and back a Democratic president, and they'll do all they can.
Yeah.
The acceptance of the legitimacy of the existing structure at the basis of their worldview is the problem.
Okay.
Whether you call that the left or whatever.
Well, that's getting
the point of divergence.
That's getting at the point of Gaddafi perhaps being a thing which has a thought that the problem is at that level. Those who accepted the idea that it was perfectly all right for there to be a separation, you know, not the socialist or the communist, they did away with, ultimately, the institution of private property itself in the Soviet Union through collectivization, and it fell apart. They put it all into the nomenclatura. There was no balance. Gaddafi didn't want to do away in some beautiful, pristine thing, make it all government.
Right.
He wanted to maintain the private property sector, the private sector.
Well,
we maintained the private sector, but the left, the labor unions 50 years ago could have negotiated when they had some strength. It's now about 6% of the labor unions are organized now in the private sector, going down. They're going to attack private and public sector as well. They're going down because the labor input is less relevant in terms that are real in terms of production. Now, they could have bargained for collectively bargainable thing to spread the ownership and build the capital assets in a way which are owned by the people rather than by the capitalist class.
Right.
All they do is negotiate for a minimum wage or let's get $10 or a retirement,
right.
And they got the middle class built up. But now it's coming to the end. Gaddafi in the private sector, the ownership of the capital instruments and the way they're formed is owned by the masses,
right.
Is a way of distributing demand to people who can become part of a leisured class that is able to live that way. That's what the world needs. We don't have a model for it except in Libya. And at that level of ideology, he has the private sector and a way of distributing the demand to the people at large. That's what we need and we don't have.
And you have the private sector on a leash in a way where it's not a noose. You could have two Libyas.
Yes, he brought them under control.
Two Libyas side by side.
Yeah.
And in one, have things as they are, and in the other, allow landlords, for example. Mm-hmm. And you would end up with two Libyas. One of them, you have a landlord or a REIT or some other corporate institution that owns all of the housing, and everyone is a serf to that, and in the other, the Libya that exists. You'd have, in each case, encouragement of private ownership and development, but because there are constraints on the things that are essential to life, mm-hmm. Those are socialized.
Well, that's all the things you're talking about. Reasonable housing, automobile, education, health, these things are socialized.
That's right.
They spread it around.
That's right.
They spread it around. Socialism. Okay, that's good. That's private, that's public sector. There's a lot going on. And the people, the river project, electricity into every village, right. Sewage, right. All of these things. That can be done by that. But then the thing comes back, what about the private sector? He was not against doing away with the private sector.
Right.
It's just that when you form the major problem confronting capitalism, the assets are becoming increasingly responsible for production.
Right.
Sara Lee doesn't have a single person in there turning out all that cheesecake.
Right.
It's all just algorithms, and it's going that way. And the thing is, the only way the people think and are sold a bill of goods is to get income to people is for them to have a job.
Right.
A labor relationship to production which is galloping toward capital. The whole trend of the world is toward capital instruments for producing wealth, and it's all owned by a tiny plutocratic class. And the left shouldn't have any part of that. Right. They should not allow that to happen, but they have.
Reminds me of
Libya is ahead of the. I was trying to get a thing of Libya being ahead of history's curve,
right.
Of what's required.
Right.
And for that reason, they may be targeted by our predators.
Like I said, I think that Libya is a step beyond the bulk of where national, economies are organized or political systems are organized, certainly, and is a transitional one to something that's a different path than
like what we should all be thinking about.
Yeah.
We should be all thinking about that question
and again,
of
the real threat.
Distributing ownership, but we don't. All they talk about is jobs.
And
Did you notice?
Yeah, well, they're talking. Look,
the progressive.
First of all, when you have a room full of people that are starving, you might discuss agriculture, but the first thing you're going to talk about are sandwiches. Okay,
yeah,
that's
right.
the reason.
Okay,
that's the reason that people will listen when you bring up sandwiches in the first place.
Yeah, and they'll come to the meeting.
And they'll eat.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, certainly the solution to the problems of workers here isn't just a job, although the solution to the problem of starving next week or being out of their home, a job would solve that somewhat.
Well, they get money.
It'll bring them back here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, because they already had a job a generation ago at IBM that was guaranteed for life that turned out not to work out that way. And
but we're going to have to get to a world of people who are going to be comfortably leisured and comfortably leisured as a standard. We don't have a way of doing that now. We have to do it, and they have to have the means to, so that they then can do what they want to do on their own. It's called liberated.
If you look at what happened in Argentina after the collapse last time,
that was a couple of years ago,
right?
3 years ago. Yeah.
So they were kind of in an analogous situation to here. There was no way to revive it on using the existing structures. They abandoned the factories and all of that. Finally, people were like, you know what? I don't need to get paid. I don't need money. I need shoes. We made shoes down there. Let's go down and make some shoes. And they went down to the factory and started producing it. And by the way, those guys over there need shoes too. And they have milk. And they restructured the economy from the bottom up somewhat.
But that could be celebrating the wonderful work ethic.
No,
I'm saying the work ethic ought to be attacked, not celebrated.
I agree. No,
it should be work should be left to the people who are doing what they want to do, not what they're being ordered to do in a militaristic model.
We have all of the tools available to us now to produce all of the things that we need to produce and to distribute the tedious part of it or whatever, in a way that it's not a large load on anybody.
Yeah, but we don't have a way of distributing the buying power to people who are being ought to be displaced from the productive process. They ought to be displaced. They ought to be put out of work.
The first thing that
so that they can be free to do something meaningful like paint or something that's meaningful.
To get there, the first thing that we need to do is demagnetize the discs that are keeping the books that are the legacy of the existing order, and then have people look at the fact that there are factories and farms and other things that produce these goods and services that we need, and sit down without the books, without deeds, titles, or anything else that are a legacy of the last 200,000 years, and say, how tomorrow do we get the stuff that we need done without any of us having to work too hard?
Yeah, okay, well, that's good. But one of the things is we started talking with yesterday or today's program, we've been 2 hours here, is that we're going to have, we're trying to get to a thing about seeing, we're like in the womb, we're gestating, we're coming to a new qualitative transformation in the evolutionary process itself. We're coming to that. The water is about to break. We're about to come into a new, if we get to a point where, like, for instance, the Gaia is a good principle, where it's an organism, we're in universe, we got to get to a thing where, like 100,000 cells in a human organism, they all have to have oxygen, they all work, their systems, there's difference and all that. We get to that for the whole of the thing. There will be a resonancy, like an orchestra, that will interaccommodate us to universe, a liberated order, rather than an enslaved one out of history. We need a model for that, and what we don't have now is a model of how we're going to realize that as a potential, and where are the models that relate to the economic, political, and social organization that relates to how we can set up that kind of a society. Libya may be a precursor country to setting up that kind of a model that is relevant to what the world needs.
Tell people to read, I suggest to everyone that can still hear me, read the Green Book as a point of departure. I went to an international conference on that 1.5 years ago, and I found it a very interesting place to start.
Yeah, it is a very interesting place to start, and Libya might be for that reason that they're upset with him, because he set that, and we ought not to just tolerate him. But the system that has to be presented by the intellectuals is liberate, it has to be so comprehensively appropriate. The thing that goes through the intentional integrity, that goes through the geodesic reality, the broader thing, has to be so